like to thank the organizers of this conference, and in particular Professor Lim, for their generous invitation, which has given me the opportunity to prepare a paper on the following topic: blowing out the candle, light and shade in the Constitutional Court of Korea's impeachment ruling. So, as we all know, 8 justices of the Constitutional Court of Korea rendered on March 10, 2017, an historical ruling in which they concluded that the respondent, then President Park Geun-hye, was removed from office. The following day, the last of 20 mass protest rallies that had demanded Park's ousting since October 2016. So the last of those mass protest rallies was held to celebrate the Candlelight Revolution's victory. Now, to the members and observers of this movement, the Constitutional Court's verdict was largely seen as the institutional consecration of the popular struggle for a more or new democratic order. Yet, I believe that a close reading of the impeachment ruling reveals a number of tensions between the claims voiced in South Korea's streets and the arguments articulated by the court. So, here is the idea that I would like to present today: that the Constitutional Court of Korea's decision blew out the candle of the anti-Park or pro-impeachment mobilization in a double direction. On the one hand, effectively realizing the movement's wish for leadership change, but also, on the other hand, discursively frustrating a number of its underlying political vision and demands. So, in the paper, I explore 2 main manifestations of this paradox, a paradox by which the Candlelight Movement, while having obtained from constitutional justice what it wanted, the removal of Park Geun-hye from office. So while having obtained that, the Candlelight Movement at the same time largely appears to have been erased from the court's judgment. And erased not just linguistically, because it is never mentioned or acknowledged in the judgment, but also erased, I would say, substantially, in a way that excluded both the vision and some of the core demands of the Candlelight Movement from the scope and the content of the court's decision. And this, I argue, has also been accomplished both in the court's majority ruling and in its 2 separate but concurring opinions. So as was mentioned earlier today, the court's ruling was unanimous in the sense that all the 8 justices agreed that Park Geun-hye should be removed from office, but at the same time, such a decision was pronounced not in 1 but in 3 voices, a majority ruling and 2 separate but concurring opinions. Now, in the majority ruling, this erasure or exclusion of the Candlelight Movement was accomplished through the depolitization of impeachment, which took a triple form: depolitization of its procedure or legal basis, depolitization of the factual context of the case, and depolitization of the problem or matter at hand, namely the acts of violation committed by the President in the course of her official duties. Then, the second manifestation of this paradox I look at is how even separate but concurring opinions by justices more critical of the Park Geun-hye presidency than the majority can be read as attempts to extinguish the flame of contentious mass politics. So, while those 2 opinions departed from the majority ruling by paying more attention to citizens, whether citizens were associated with victims of the Sewol Ferry sinking or whether they were identified as actors of needed constitutional reforms, this form of inclusion, I believe, was far from translating into a celebration of contentious mass politics as embedded in candlelight rallies. So in the time I have left, I first want to focus on how the majority ruling contributed to depoliticize the problem at stake in the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, and as a result to exclude some of the Candlelight Movement's core claims from its ruling. And then I will consider how the two separate but concurring opinions disagreed with the majority's constructions of the ground for impeachment, but disagreed only up to a certain point. And this point, I argue, is justice's disregard for street demonstrations and protests as a valid modality of democratic political action. And this is where I believe the Constitutional Court can be said to have itself acted politically. Not in the partisan sense of taking sides, and again, the court was very careful in its ruling precisely not to side with the Candlelight Movement. But maybe the court has acted politically in the deeper sense of having defined and defended a certain model of politics. So, the grounds for impeachment. Out of the 7 grounds examined in the impeachment ruling, 3 were retained by the majority as justifying Park's ousting. And these were the violation of our duty to realize the public interest of all citizens, as opposed to serving the private interests of a few individuals, namely Choi Soon-sil and our entourage. Then second, the violation of the president's obligation to protect secrets and confidential information, particularly in relation to state affairs. And third, the violation of the freedom and property rights of private enterprises by having coerced a number of conglomerates to make financial donations to organizations under the control of Choi Soon-sil, such as the Mir and K-Sport foundations. By contrast, the president was not found to have abused a power to appoint public officials or civil servants. She was not found to have infringed on the freedom of media, nor to have violated her obligation to protect the right to life and to faithfully perform her duties. So procedurally, the first 3 grounds were rejected on the basis that there was a lack of evidence to conclude that Park Geun-hye had committed such violations, while the 4th rejected ground, the obligation to faithfully perform official duties, was considered by the court as a political and not a legal question, and therefore ruled out from the scope of the impeachment ruling. So that's procedurally. Now, concretely, the rejection of the last 2 grounds, the obligation to protect the right to life and the obligation to faithfully perform presidential duties, the rejection of these 2 grounds contributed to leave the 2014 sinking of the Sewol ferry beyond the scope of the majority ruling. So the Sewol ferry sinking was briefly mentioned by Professor Bedesky, and this issue was certainly at the heart of the Candlelight rallies and even provided the Candlelight Movement with its symbol of dissent, the yellow ribbon. Yet, the responsibility of Park Geun-hye in unresponsively handling the sinking of the Sewol ferry is not, I believe, the only Candlelight Movement's claim excluded from the ruling. As a matter of fact, even when looking at the 3 grounds that were recognized as justifying the president's removal from office, one can argue that these grounds were constructed in ways that clearly departed from public perceptions and demands. So this rupture, I believe, is best illustrated by 2 points which were reiterated by the majority throughout its reasoning. On the one hand, the majority treated Park Geun-hye's use and abuse of her position as personal rather than a political problem, coming from a personal, her own misbehavior rather than a structural imbalance of power, and therefore considered that removing Park Geun-hye from office in itself would be a sufficient remedy to all the evils considered in the decision, not arguing, not calling for further reforms. On the other hand, another point that the majority insisted on, which can be seen as in contradiction with the claims of the Candlelight Movement, is the majority's insistence on exculpating economic actors, such as conglomerates, and in particular in considering chaebols as victims of corruption and as victims of the Park Geun-hye administration, rather than as actors of business-government collusion. So the majority ruling was challenged by the 2 separate but concurring opinions on all these points. The first opinion focused on revisiting the response by Park Geun-hye, or the lack of response by Park Geun-hye, to the sinking of the Sewol ferry. In this opinion, Justices Kim Il-soo and Lee Jin-sung agreed with the majority that the president had not contravened a duty to protect the right to life, so not holding Park Geun-hye directly responsible for the event and its tragic outcome. But in opposition to their colleagues, in opposition to the majority, the 2 justices considered that the violation of the president's obligation to faithfully perform her duties could be a basis for impeachment, that is, was a legal and not just a political matter. And that led them to re-examine in detail Park's actions or inactions on the day of the accident. So in the end, Justices Kim and Lee did find that Park Geun-hye violated her obligation to faithfully react to a national crisis such as the Sewol ferry sinking. They did find that she had not done enough on that day, in particular because she was not present at the Blue House but stayed in a private residence, so they did find a violation on that ground. But they argued nonetheless that such a violation alone did not suffice to justify a removal from office. The last opinion by Justice Han Chang-ho appears to carry a radical critique of Park Geun-hye presidency, as it searched deeper than other justices for the structural causes in which the abuses she committed could be rooted. And his opinion offered as an answer the notion of imperial presidency and blames the hyper-concentration of power, characteristic of the system, the imperial presidency, on the Constitution's existing power structure itself, also finding that such phenomena as the existence of shadowy interests or government business collusions was symptoms of this existing power structure. So Justice Han's position stood in stark contrasts on that point with the court's hegemonic discourse. In particular, contrary to the rest of the court, Justice Han construed the Constitution not solely as being in danger and deserving protection. This is the rest of the court's position, that the Constitution was endangered by Park Geun-hye and therefore needs to be protected. But here, Justice Han reasoned that actually the Constitution was not only in danger, but may itself be posing a threat, in particular because of its failure to diffuse power. As a result, Justice Han's opinion deemed constitutional reforms both necessary and necessitating citizens' participation to incorporate their views and opinions. Yet, the definition proposed by Justice Anne of the modalities of this participation primarily revolved around public communication and deliberation. And this makes it quite difficult to read his opinion as a tribute to the Candlelight Movement, whose demands for a new political, social, economic order were formulated through peaceful but contentious mobilization. Therefore, not only is Justice Anne's opinion devoid of any reference to the candlelight demonstrations, like the rest of the impeachment ruling, but the kind of citizens' involvement it calls for appears far from the investment of the public space by protest rallies. And to conclude, I would say that this, I believe, reveals a discursive commonality shared by all justices, their deployment of arguments to contain and even extinguish the flame of contentious mass politics. Thank you.